Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm Natasha Duarte, the director of the Composting Association of Vermont, and I'm also the chair of the Vermont Farm to Plate Network's Food Cycle Coalition Community of Practice. And today we are joined by Vermont's Ecological Sanitation Coalition for what's going to be hopefully a really interactive, interesting dialogue for everybody. All right. And so today we're going to talk about what the Ecological Sanitation Coalition is. Who are these folks and what are they trying to do? We're going to make sure that everyone understands and is on the same page about compost toilets and what we're even talking about. And then we're going to be talking about some of the misconceptions and what our coalition members who are here with us today wish people knew. So we're really interested to hear what you all think as well. And then we'll talk about what's next for folks who want to stay in touch and get involved in this project. So right now I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can be more in discussion mode while I introduce the folks with me today. So Chrissy Wade, you can wave, Chrissy, so folks know who you are, is the coalition leader. She's an off-grid homesteader in rural Vermont. She and her family studied Joseph Jenkins' Humanure Handbook and created a compost toilet system back in 2017 following Joe's guidelines. Chrissy became a certified UVM Vermont master composter and is passionate about educating regulators, lawmakers, and homesteaders about safe and healthy eco-sanitation systems. We're also joined by Dr. Deb Nair, who is a professor in UVM's Plant and Soil Science Department. Dr. Nair has over 35 years of experience as a researcher, educator, and graduate student mentor. She leads the Soil Ecology and Biological Indicators Laboratory at UVM with research interests in developing biological indicators for environmental monitoring of soils. Her recent focus is on the microbiology of compost with the goal of developing value-added products that foster beneficial microbiome to suppress disease on plants. And rounding us out is Julia Kovicki. She's the education director at the Rich Earth Institute. Julia coordinates Rich Earth's home gardening education program, their annual urine reclamation summit, which is exciting to know that such a thing even exists here in Vermont. And she also is really engaged in community engagement for the Institute. She assists with social research, including Rich Earth's SARE-funded farm research projects. She received her BA in Environmental Studies from Skidmore College in 2018 and has a Master of Research in Human Geography from the University of Glasgow. In the past, her research has explored combined sewer overflows in Troy, New York, glass eels, community science, and the environmental humanities. Julia has been an avid key cycler since joining the Institute in 2019. So thank you all. Thank the three of you for joining us today. And I want to just get started, maybe Chrissy, with you, if you can explain to us, what is the Ecological Sanitation Coalition? It's a big name, right? So what is this coalition about, and why does it exist? What are you hoping to achieve through this coalition?
Yeah, thanks, Natasha, and thanks everybody for joining today. So we are an all-volunteer, unpaid group of practitioners, advocates, and/or professionals with a passion for safe, supported ecological sanitation through education and streamlined legal pathways. That's kind of in a nutshell what we are. Yeah, should I share our goals?
Yeah,
A quick brief.
share your goals and explain maybe a little bit as well about why this group is needed in Vermont.
Yeah. Yeah. So why do we need a group? So there's no easy regulatory pathway, is what I discovered as a homesteader. So we want to support the creation of a streamlined legal pathway for safe and supported humanure composting in Vermont. So our goals include providing peer-reviewed science, which Deb is a really important piece of our team for that, from UVM. and to provide educational resources and to create what's called best management practice guidelines for compost toilet systems in Vermont for homesteaders, rulemakers, and legislators. So it's kind of a double thing going on here. There's education, which is the primary focus right now, and also wanting to support new streamlined legal pathways because there's barriers to that, we found.
Great. So maybe just briefly, what is currently allowed in Vermont? Like where do we stand with all of this? You said that there's not a clear path, but is this practice allowed?
So you can have a compost toilet in the state of Vermont, which is awesome, and I'm really grateful for that. So there's three different, ways you can handle the contents of your compost toilet, right? And what I learned, was surprised to find, was that the main way that is kind of the top thing that's on the list of the three things is to take the contents to the landfill. So as a compost toilet, sustainable homesteader, that was not an option I was too excited about. Or probably most people using a compost toilet, I would say. The other option was to take it to a wastewater treatment plant, which is similarly not, recycling this material. And then the third way is to have a shallow burial permit. And that pathway was really, when I asked some questions about that, we found that there's not really any guidelines for that and not many people doing it. And the pathway for that does not actually include composting of that material first. There's no requirement to compost the material before shallow burying. And so that was something that our team found to be not necessarily a best practice.
Yeah, so that actually segues really well into the next thing I wanted to touch on, this whole concept. And I'm gonna put a couple pictures up on my screen in just a second, but so you mentioned that composting the contents isn't necessarily part of that, but I think a lot of people may have the misconception that compost toilets actually do all the composting. So maybe just to get us all on the same page about what this looks like and what we're actually talking about when the coalition talks about compost toilets. I'm going to share my screen with a couple pictures, and then Chrissy, maybe you can start us off.
Yeah, I'm happy to provide I got a definition from Joe Jenkins that I want to quote of what a compost toilet is, because there's so many different, ideas out there. So I'm going to quote Joe, and I'm going to let you guys know that it's a collection device used to recycle organic materials. It's not a waste disposal device used to dispose of sewage, as is a flush toilet. And the purpose of a compost toilet is to collect human fecal material and urine so that the collected material can be recycled. When something's recycled, it's not wasted and should not be referred to as waste, which is why we call it humanure instead of human waste. So this is the most simple system that probably creates the most angst in a lot of, regulators because it's not understood well. And this is just a simple, at the very most raw way to collect the material into the bucket. And as you can see, that is just a cover material there on top. It's peat moss. I use a mix of sawdust and peat moss typically, but this is mostly peat moss, as you can tell from the color. And there's no odor. So it's absolutely magical and super simple and can go anywhere. So also for, folks who have septic issues that break down and they don't know what to do, this is a safe way to collect that material, put a lid on it, and then, so this is one type of system.
Yeah, and there are many other types, and we can get into that a little bit later. But then, so are these the systems where that material goes?
Exactly. So these are the contained compost bins. As you can see, very, very well contained, and they're lined with hay all around the edges. So there's nothing seeping out at all. And so there's one up here with a lid on the left, as you can see. And there's this thing up on the right we call the humanure hacienda, because you've got two compost bins on each side, and in the middle is where you can store your carbon, your hay, because it's a very important component of composting safely is to use proper carbon cover.
Yeah, so let's bring Chrissy into the conversation. I'm sorry, Julia into the conversation now. So these the compost toilets that we just saw collect everything, right? So urine as well as other matter, but there are different diversion systems that Julia is going to tell us a little bit about.
Yeah, so as Chrissy was saying, there are many different kinds of compost toilets that can be used safely and effectively, and kind of depending on how much time and energy you want to invest in maintenance, different options might be better for you. So this is one option where I think there's very little time that you need to invest in terms of moving the solids around. So the way it works essentially is there's a urine diverting toilet that has a divided bowl. So the front half of the toilet diverts into a urine storage tank you can have in your basement. And you can then use that urine to fertilize your garden, or in our case, in our community collection program here in Brattleboro. And then the front half connects through this chute to a barrel, and that or a bin, and that bin will sit for about 6 months. It takes about 6 months to fill up the bin, and once it's full, you can just wheel it away and wheel in an empty bin. And connect the full bin to this secondary composting you can see here. And so that can then sit there for another year, composting further with some aeration provided by a fan system that's also connected to the toilet fan system. And then once those have been sitting there, you can then move them on to your next stage of things. And legally that would probably mean putting it in your shallow burial location after that.
Right.
And one of the benefits of urine diversion, I think, is also for the composting system itself. It keeps the solids drier, which can kind of have some benefits for the composting of the solids as well.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions we got, we did invite folks to submit questions when they registered, and a few did, which was great. So thank you for that. But one of the questions we got, I just wanted you to touch on really briefly, Julia, is there was a question about, like, we have a community garden and we have no facilities. Like, is there a pea cycling option in a setting like that? Or is it really sort of an integrated system that you're talking about, like the pictures we see here?
Yeah. So you can also just collect your urine separately and use that to fertilize your garden. But whether or not you need to sanitize the urine really depends on the context. So if you're collecting to fertilize your own backyard garden, you can just use it straight away, and it's totally, largely pathogen free. And there are World Health Organization guidelines to support that practice. But if you want to fertilize a public setting, especially on farms, it's required to sanitize. And we have a permitting pathway with the state of Vermont to do that using our pasteurizer. You can also sanitize urine through storage by storing it for 6 months, according to the World Health Organization guidelines. The pH in the urine will rise high enough to kill any potential pathogens that could be in there.
Great, thank you for that. So Deb, you shared some pictures with me before this about moldering privies, and I thought you might be able to touch on a little bit about what we're seeing in these pictures and how this is either the same or different from some of the other methods that Chrissy and Julia just talked about.
Yeah, this is a type of toilet that's pretty common in our state parks system, especially at the remote campsites. And this is an example of it. So on the left, you see kind of the hut there, and they make sure those are placed, it's got to be uphill, quite a distance so that there's no way that it would contact water. But so the enclosed part is the one that's being used currently, and there's some instructions there for people to, once they, make a contribution, then they cover that with some wood shavings. So it's kind of layering that. And so what you see in the middle is actually the other side. Once they deem that it's fairly full, then that's allowed to rest. And that usually has a lid on it. We just took the lid off so that you can see it. And so that's been resting for like 3 to 5 years. So quite a while. And then on the right, it just kind of, the one in the middle has a lot of leaves. So you got good nitrogen on the right. You can see the reality is people tend to overuse the wood shavings. So it almost just looks like a pile of wood shavings.
Yep. Fear
And
of odor, right?
yeah, oh, absolutely no odor. I just had a group of UVM students out there just a week ago at Kettle Pond, and we were servicing those. And that's one of the comments they said. They go, no matter how many times I told them there was no odor, they really agree with me now. They're like, it's amazing. So what I meant by servicing it, and here are some of the students involved, is it's dealing with the shallow burial system. So there's actually not a specific, composting process, but this is something that we've worked out with the state that's agreeable. So on the right, you can see there's a pit that we're digging. Ours were 1.5 to 2 feet deep. The point is, when you put material in there, you want to make sure there's at least room for 6 inches of soil on top of the material that you're burying. It's a challenge to do because you can see a lot of roots sticking out right there to dig those. And then over on the left and middle, you can see they're shoveling out the material, and also from some burials, putting it in that pit. Then it gets covered up with the soil, and we camouflage it so it won't attract any extra attention from humans or otherwise.
Thanks, Deb. And one of the questions we got that maybe you can touch on, because we have these pictures of the shallow burial up, is like, why can't you just have it in a pile?
Yeah. So, I've actually had friends ask me that before. And so it's really not best practice because, you're not able to keep it contained. It could attract vectors. It's not going to compost as evenly, because you've got that outside layer that's, the middle's composting, but the outer layers are much slower. You don't want to have to be turning that open pile like that. So when you have it contained, it's going to be much safer.
Yeah, and you just walked right into the next question. And Deb, I'll actually put this question to you, and then you can add on to that is, I've heard that we don't want to attract vectors. What is a vector? So just getting us all on the same page. Deb, you want to take that?
Sure. A vector would be some organism that's going to be a carrier for a pathogen. So it could be a virus that they're carrying or a bacterium. For example, malaria is the vector is a mosquito. It's the mosquito. When it bites you, then it would deliver the bacterium that causes the malaria. And it could be that a vector might be maybe a rodent or a vertebrate that might be, maybe a raccoon or something that might be carrying something. One thing with that I think is a misconception to thinking about, one of the types of pathogens is viruses, but you have to keep in mind a virus is an obligate parasite, and it requires a living host for it to be active, because it's using the host's genetic machinery to replicate. So, the only way it can really get there is by a vector.
Right. Now that we all know what vectors are, right? So they're the pathways, essentially. It can take many different forms. So you started us sort of going in that direction, Deb, and I wonder if you maybe want to add a little bit more about some other common misconceptions about compost toilets or humanure. And is there research that shows that humanure is safe to use? So it's like diversion, but can you also use what you compost afterwards?
Well, I'll just back up. One thing you said about the pile.
Mm-hmm.
Issue is that the, formal definition of what compost is it's a very managed and very controlled process that demands a balance of carbon to nitrogen ratio. There's science behind what temperatures you're trying to reach if it's a thermophilic compost, and the temperatures are designed to kill pathogens. But managing the recipe, making sure the moisture is right. So the point is, it's a very controlled process, and it's a microbially driven process, and the microbes are decomposing material. So one of the, misconceptions I might have is, as you saw some of these systems, like the moldering toilet, you're not actually seeing true composting happen, right? So that's one thing, is that's dealing with the shallow burial. But, that is an improvement definitely over what they formerly did in terms of hauling this material, hiking it down, putting it in a canoe, rowing it across the lake, putting it in a vehicle to haul to the landfill. that certainly was not a very desirable practice. I might just mention that, that there's really science based on these practices. The development of what temperatures to do, that's based on some very rigorous science conducted by USDA and EPA in the 1970s. And that's been demonstrated over and over that if you follow those particular temperatures and turning requirements, and you got to do a good job, you can't be slack about this, then you can get good pathogen kill.
Yeah, thank you. Chrissy, one of the things that I thought you might touch on, one of the misconceptions that was shared was that this was a lot riskier. And Deb, you sort of talked about it, or you set up the question in terms of like putting it in a canoe and taking it around, like all of this process. But one of the things that was shared through the registration was some concerns about like, is it safe compared to like a traditional septic system? Like why can't we just use the septic systems that we're all, whether it's city or a leach field, like that we're used to in our houses as they're built currently? So do you think that this is just as safe or maybe safer than that?
Well, I think it's certainly not for everyone, that these conventional systems are what a lot of people are choosing for good reason, so I think that's fine. It really depends on your choice and lifestyle, and what your goals are. I certainly think it shouldn't be less okay than a traditional septic system. I believe that, all systems are, there's risk involved. There's failure that happens in regular traditional systems. There might be failures, and there will be with some compost toilet systems. So it's about learning how to do it best, and following the science, which is what we're doing, and educating people on how to do it as safely and effectively as possible. And I do want to add too to what Deb said about temperature, because temperature is ideal, right? But we know in Vermont, we're not always going to get to that temperature, that sweet spot of like 131, or 132, which we all want for our compost right away. So what we also know is if you can't reach temperature, then you use more time. So that's the time you leave and let it, let your compost cure will have the same effect on, reducing the pathogens that we don't want in the material at the time that we eventually want to use it to put back into the earth.
Yeah. Julie, I see you nodding your head, and then we'll go to Deb.
Yeah, just sort of to build on what Chrissy was saying about septic systems, and to clarify a little bit, maybe in Vermont, if you do have a compost toilet, you also still need to have a septic system, particularly to manage the gray water effluent from your house. And there are gray water treatment technologies that are out there that I think combined with a compost toilet could provide a whole home solution, but that's not something that we currently have a pathway for in Vermont. It's something that maybe a little research could help us figure out what kinds of options could be used for that, especially as our village centers are trying to house more people for our smart growth goals in Vermont. Septic systems or space for new wastewater treatment systems, including septic, is one of the barriers to that smart growth. So finding options that could have a lower space footprint and provide reuse options for homes, I think could be an interesting option for Vermont's planning goals.
Wow, that's really interesting. Deb, let's put it over to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to the comment about time versus temperature. There's science behind this. I had a project a number of years ago when Highfield Center for Composting was in, and we did a replicated trial on it. And we had several different recipes. They were 2 recipe, 2 temperature, etc. And then we had one that wasn't necessarily. It was like out the back of a dairy barn with manure that was too high in nitrogen. And basically, in a nutshell, we could show we had excellent kill following the National Organic Program standards and those temperature regimes within a fairly short period. But or we were killing plant pathogens and also weed seeds too. But in the one without the dairy barn, we got the same kill, but it took quite a bit longer, more like 6 months as opposed to 1.5 months to 2 months.
Yeah.
one of the things we often want to do is be conservative on time, right? I would say 1 year is being conservative, but in the state parks, we want it multiple years just to be extra sure, you know. And those samples are sent in to a lab and can be tested. And so far, they've been way, way below any, barely detectable.
Yeah, so let's stay with that testing because we did have a question about that. And then I want to circle back to some other sort of contamination concerns that were raised in the questions that were submitted. But so Deb just said that the state parks test theirs. Chrissy, do you test yours at home?
Yeah, that I do. And we have had stellar results. I remember when we first started doing this and took the samples to Endine Lab in Williston, and was absolutely floored with the clean rating that we got. So I learned from working with the solid waste department of Vermont, a lot about the counts in fecal coliform that are acceptable for Class A biosolid standards. And our material tested out every time, like above and beyond Class A biosolid standards, which has unrestricted use in various ways that I don't understand completely. But I'm not saying that ours should have unrestricted use. I'm just saying that it tested out that way, and it was really exciting.
Mm-hmm. Julia, do you guys do testing, or are there specific tests that you recommend for the pea cycling?
Yeah, we do annual testing for our permit of the urine fertilizer that we collect, and we actually with our new so at Rich Earth Institute we have a facilities permit for our human waste or human resource processing that we do. In our updated permit, we added onto that starting to do solids composting on site as well. So we're working to create the facilities to do that so we could collect from folks who have toilets like the ones I was showing earlier and compost them at our facility, but we're not doing that quite yet. But we do test our urine for all sorts of things, including pathogens and also heavy metals, which urine doesn't have really. Also, we just tested for the first time this year for PFAS levels, which we hadn't done before, and got the results back. And the levels that we found in the urine from our program were lower than, I think, California's drinking water levels. So very low, but detectable because I think it's kind of present in all of our bodies and in our blood. And so, of course, it comes out to some level in our urine.
Yeah, so a follow-up question for you, Julia, and then I want to ask the same question, but we had a couple people write in asking about pharmaceuticals. So you just touched on PFAS, which I think many of us are sort of like it's in the background of most conversations or many conversations we're having. But this whole, I think there's a lot of concern about pharmaceuticals and if they persist and can we test for them? And is that something that we should be concerned about? Because if we're taking pharmaceuticals, presumably they're also in what we excrete. So Julia and then Deb and then Chrissy, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, so the Rich Earth Institute in partnership with the University of Michigan did a 6-year research project on the fate of pharmaceuticals in our urine when using it as a fertilizer. And essentially they found that it seems to be broken down in the soil so that it's not really accumulating in the crop tissue at a significant level. And the stat they came up with to communicate the smallness that's in the crop tissue is that you'd have to eat a pound of urine fertilized lettuce every day for 1,000 years to then get back the same amount of caffeine that's in a cup of coffee, with caffeine sort of being the worst case scenario because it's the most prevalent drug in our urine. Mm-hmm. And then just sort of a note on PFAS too. I think it's important to think about the sort of reusing human waste from a compost toilet paradigm when compared to what we're currently doing with our biosolids that come from wastewater treatment plants, which are being land applied and combine human waste with waste from a lot of different industrial processes that have far higher levels of PFAS contamination. So there's sort of a way that source separating our waste can also help separate it from some of the other contaminants it might be mixed with in the conventional wastewater stream.
That's a great point. Yeah. Deb, do you want to weigh in on the research?
Yeah. And I might ask you to pull up slide 11 eventually here, but sure. Just as she does that, I was just going to mention one thing we want to keep in mind is pharmaceutical, that type of chemical is used, humans use it, but we also use a lot of it on our livestock that's produced, whether it's dairy or pigs or poultry. So, and we currently have guidelines for managing those manures that are very effective. So I think we just need to keep perspective that, we're talking about mammals and how they deal with it. So there's some similarities. So what I wanted to show you on this particular slide, one of the things with pharmaceuticals would be uses of antibiotics. And I know that comes up as a question a lot. So there's some good science on this, looking at the degradation of antibiotics. This is just one example where we had samples that were spiked with various antibiotics by themselves or mixtures, and then monitored through time. So basically what this is showing is we see degradation through time, and the conclusion was it might slow down the composting process a little bit initially, but they do reduce through time. And I might have you back up one slide up. So we might say, we have a lot of different waste treatment options. And so we can weigh out, how does, say, composting compare to some of the other options we might have, like anaerobic digestion or, piles or whatever. But on the left-hand side, you can see, I tried to highlight the 84 and that's statistically significant. That's the relatively high number right there, showing that composting has greater reduction and more effective than, say, if we're doing anaerobic digestion when it comes to managing antibiotics. And on the right-hand side just shows the effect of temperature, and we can see the reduction. This is antibiotic resistance genes. And the MGE is just genetic elements. These could be antibiotic resistance that maybe move between different bacteria on their plasmids. And the bottom line is, in the temperature, compost is pretty effective regardless of temperature, but temperature becomes really important if we're using anaerobic digestion. So I guess the bottom line is people are studying this. There's certainly a lot more studies that need to be done. But what we've seen, now looks encouraging.
Great. Thank you. Chrissy, anything you want to add to this?
I think that's wonderful information. I read Joe's book, The Humanure Handbook, has some studies as well that talk about this. There's some good studies that show that it does reduce what we don't want in it.
Great. Thank you. So let's move into sort of what are, we've touched on this, but I'm curious if there's anything any of you would like to add in terms of, like, what are things you wish people understood better about this practice? Like, is that we haven't, not necessarily a misconception, but that you feel like, is there a missing piece? Like, are people just like not connecting all the dots? Does anyone want to?
I want to say that, it's in the language that we're trying to, Joe talks a lot about in his books, because a lot of people refer to it, and we still sometimes slip to composting toilet, human waste, the goal of the compost toilet users for the most part is to recycle that material, to make a renewable resource that is safe. And most of these toilets are not composting in the, receptacle that you are putting your deposits in your home. So that's a big misconception. I feel like that there's, that's the focus of our education, is around how to, safely manage the material, that you're producing.
Yeah, Deb.
Yeah, I'll just mention is, ultimately we want to be making decisions based on scientific data, right? But one of the things we have to deal with is doing science, and good science takes time. And, takes people, takes money and time, and sometimes years and years and years. And it just, right now, we don't want to, the policy don't want to, makers find that timeline is not how policy works, right? The science is often lagging the policy. So they're just on different time schedules. But I do want to just point out that there is a lot of good science. We do want to make, science-based decisions, but the timelines just don't match up always.
Yeah.
And I want to add too that people are doing this anyway all over. We all know that people are. There's lots of compost toilet users, and so wanting to provide support and education and science to manage it safely.
Right, Julia.
Yeah, and to sort of build on that too, I think just that there is a lot of precedents out there for different ways that other states have regulated how we manage our human waste, and also other countries, including in Europe. And I think the We Stand code, which was developed by Recode based out in Oregon, has some good kind of guidelines or templates or suggestions of ways that we could regulate our toilets differently. And then I think one other thing I would say is that there are a lot of resources out there to help you in your decision making about what kind of toilet or system you think might work best for your home. Point of Shift, who I see Kelsey is here today, offers a lot of support for folks on that. And then there's also Nutrient Networks, which is an organization that helps people with compost toilet consultations. And then Rich Earth on our website has some information about urine diverting toilets and options out there. So there's a lot of people out here to help you with thinking through that as well.
Yeah, and before we go to you, Deb, I'll just say that we'll add some of the links when we circulate the recording. So if you didn't quite get all of those names down or the different organizations, we can provide some hot links to those sites. Deb.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to, we have guidelines for handling livestock fecal material and converting it into a resource, but it seems like we get a disconnect when it's a human origin. There ends up being kind of this ick factor. And I just want to remind ourselves that we have a lot of similarities in our biology with these other animals. And so I feel like we're kind of all in the same category, and the same process, rule, etc. should apply for all of the above. And it's not a new concept. I mean, humans have been using humanure for thousands of years. I don't know the exact number, but it was a real common practice. And I think, especially in Asian cultures, very accepted and prevalent, thinking about a necessary resource. And it used to be common in the US, and then it kind of went away after World War II, and we had all this cheap synthetic fertilizer, but it's really making a resurgence of interest since the 1990s.
Mm-hmm.
Western civilizations were a little behind.
Yeah. Yep. So I just want to remind folks, if you have questions, I see some links being shared and some comments in chat, but if you do have questions, feel free to put them in chat or raise your hand. Kaylin, feel free to unmute. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, so apologies if not.
Oh, that's fine. It's Kaylin.
Kaylin.
And I just want to say hi, Deb. This is Tucker, Andrew's wife. I'm so glad you guys have this group. When Tucker told me about it, he's my husband who used to work with Deb. I was very pleased because I was on the Bolton Planning Commission. I'm from the town of Bolton, and we recently upgraded our septic system on our home about 3 years ago. And going through that process was really eye-opening for me on just how it just felt like there was no innovation around managing our waste and how expensive it is for homeowners to manage a septic system. And I'm not sure what the goals are for the group, but I hope that maybe something you look at some point is like, what is the effect of cost on homeowners and the ability to upgrade a septic system when it needs to be upgraded, because it's so expensive. And there's really no other options for people who live rurally. We also own a tiny house, which we keep on our property and rent out, and that does have a compost toilet. But according to the state or our town regulations, we can only use it for 4 months out of the year. And yet that offers affordable housing to someone because it's not connected to the septic system. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I think it's a real income issue in the state of Vermont. It's a barrier for people who don't have a lot of money to buy land and to build a house. And I'm just not sure that that's something that's really talked about in the socioeconomic challenges that we have in this state. It's how do we manage our poop? Why is it so expensive to deal with our poop? So anyway, I just wanted to say how thankful I am that you guys are talking about this. And I was really excited to come to your presentation today to learn more.
Great, thank you so much, Kaylin. And we will be, we'll sort of be wrapping with ways that folks can get more involved and what sort of our near-term goals are. But Carolyn, did you want to jump in here?
Sure. Thank you so much, everybody. This is a great session. I'm really excited about this topic. I have kind of two questions. The first one being kind of is if there's a chance to dive deeper in like what would have to change on a regulatory legal level, really to streamline and to better incentivize or make means available for households to get into composting toilets. And the other question I have is in terms of in comparison to the leach field and a traditional septic system on a single dwelling unit, is a composting toilet more flood resilient?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it kind of depends on where you live, for sure, if you're higher or lower. That's a great question. Yeah, I want to hear what other people have to say too about this, but I just want to say that there are big financial barriers. You can have a compost toilet, so that is something you can have. It's it's legal to have one. It's what you do with the contents afterward is what is what's being talked about here about what's the safe, best management way to do that.
Yeah, Julia, you want to jump in?
Yeah, well, I think it's just in terms of the relationship between compost toilets and septic systems. In Vermont, if you have a compost toilet, you can have up to a 25% reduction in the size of your septic leach field. So there can be some benefits in terms of having a smaller leach field installed. But there are other states that allow for even greater reductions in leach field size, like Massachusetts, which allows for up to a 50% reduction. And I think that maybe can help to have an impact on the affordability of those septic systems potentially. But then back to I think sort of the vision of independence from septic systems and looking at above ground solutions and some of those gray water recycling technologies, which I think is kind of the next frontier of research and matchmaking of technologies so that we can really find something that's affordable and space efficient. And then just on kind of compost toilets and their usefulness for crisis management, there's a pilot project in California. I think it's in Waterford, that's just getting started, that's demonstrating compost toilets and kind of small scale collection from compost toilets as an option for communities that have been impacted by wildfires, because it's, a sanitation option you can implement right away. It's self-contained and can be, contained and collected and help communities respond to some of the crises like wildfires or, in our case, flooding that climate change is bringing.
I think the key word you said is self-contained. And so making sure that your system, is able to have the self-contained, humanure so that you can then take it where it's safe to then, process it further.
Yeah, Deb.
I'm going to add the education component, right? People that run compost facilities go through an operator training. And that's, pretty standardized. And we're kind of missing that piece right now for looking at these technologies. And I think there's a lot of feet there. And I think if we could have more education and training and, consistent, that I think that would help a lot.
Yeah, that kind of leads into something I wanted to add to this conversation as well. CAV, the Composting Association of Vermont, is considering and starting to look at potentially putting together that kind of operator training that for this practice specifically. And again, that would cover best management practices, which could be that's like a whole training in itself, right? There's a lot of resources out there and we're not really going into the nitty gritty of those, what that looks like in today's discussion. But we are looking to see if there's enough interest for us to put together something like that. And then a component of that would be explaining where Vermont is in terms of regulation and rule right now and potential for moving towards where we want to go. And I just wanted to circle back to one of Carolyn's questions was sort of what is the legislative fix or what are the legislative goals of this coalition? There were 2 bills that were introduced last session that we may be looking to try to bring back around. And part of it, again, is looking at, and we can share those. And if anyone has more legislative policy experience, so you're very much invited to join our coalition and help spearhead this. As Chrissy said at the beginning, we're sort of doing this. This isn't any of our full-time jobs, and so we sort of come together and do what we can as we can, which makes it a slower process, perhaps, than some of the practitioners would like. But it's twofold. We know from the association's point of view, we know that people are doing this, and we know that there are either misunderstandings or concern about whether it's legal or not. Like, that was one of the questions, like, is this legal? Will it ever be legal? Well, we've already heard, right? It is already legal, but there isn't a clear pathway for that, or for people to learn. But because of this misconception, there's hesitance to look for support in how to do it well. And like composting food scraps or manure or humanure, like whatever it is, you can do it well and you can do it not so well. And we're really trying to empower people to, if you're going to be doing it anyway, how can we sort of reduce the stigma and invite people to learn together to do it well, right? Because the research, as we heard from Deb, like, there's a lot of research there that shows that it can be done safely and well, and it can also go wrong, just like any other kind of composting, right? And so it's, in my mind, it's a little bit of a teeter-totter, right? We need to show that there's enough interest that regulators and policy folks will take the time to take it seriously, and people are a little bit hesitant to show interest because they're not sure if what they're doing is okay. And so that's sort of what this group is working on. Yeah. Bruce.
Hi, thanks, Natasha.
Yeah.
And thanks, everyone. I appreciate the conversation. A couple of points. So everyone knows, Bruce Douglas. I manage wastewater programs at the state of Vermont. So this is a topic we've been in conversation with the task force, and or at least myself, almost 2 years now. So I just want to make a couple of quick points. In Kaylin, I recognize there are definitely financial barriers, and that's something that the state is very interested in addressing and coming up with ways to lower the cost of wastewater management. And I want to agree with Deb. With the science is critical. We really want to make sure we have regulations that are safe and backed up by good science. But I do want to make a point that there are significant differences in potential soil-borne and even waterborne diseases, and bacteria, viruses, protozoa, and helminths, which is kind of worms in your system that are specific to humans. And so it's a very different level of risk relative to animal manure versus human manure. But I think one thing, Chrissy, you made a really good point regarding the difference between a compost toilet and a composting toilet, that Vermont regulations only refer to composting toilets. So it's in vessel composting is what the requirement is, and it's not legal to have human waste exposed outside, and basically that would be a failed wastewater system. So I think we need to recognize that the goal of the regulations as they're written is to safely compost it, and once it's composted, material then can be properly buried according to the requirements that in addition to be below ground, they're separated from the groundwater, the water table in the soil and bedrock. So we do enable the use of composting toilets and the reduction of leach field sizes by that. But I think we just need to continue the conversation. So my goal isn't to squelch things, but just kind of make sure everyone's in the context of the current regulatory framework, and glad to be part of this conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bruce. And I'll just quickly say, because I'm sure my panelists want to jump in here, but I'll just say, everything you just said, all the more reason that we need to support people who are doing this practice to do it well, right? Like that is critical from our point of view. But raise your hands. Chrissy, Julia, Deb, do any of you want to jump in on that or respond? I guess I'll just tag on as well that I think your clarification, Bruce, around language is so important, which is why we tried to start with some of that of like, so many times people say composting toilet and they just mean a compost toilet, right? A collection system versus an in vessel, like thinking that it's actually going to happen. And there are different systems that are available, you know, currently. And so it's really critical, I think, for us to get our terminology and our language correct and to be as precise as possible. Because when I hear composting toilet, I mostly assume that people mean the collection system, a compost toilet, not that the expectation is for it to be composting in vessel where it's being used. And so I just edit that out. And so that's a really interesting clarification that I appreciate, Bruce, because I'm so used to people using those terms interchangeably that I assume we're all talking about the collection system and not an in-vessel composting system.
Right, because I have my compost bucket, you know, in the kitchen, you know, for kitchen scraps. You know, that's a compost bucket as opposed to I'm not planning to have that compost under the kitchen counter.
Right, that's right. And a lot of people say compost bucket. It's really a food scrap bucket, right? Because it's not the compost bucket. And then you can actually use the same word. And, you know, like I take my compost bucket to a compost and I use compost. Like there's different stages of material that we all talk about. Carolyn, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I just thought that was a little confusing to hear. And just the follow-up question maybe for Bruce on that. It sounded to me like what you refer to in terms of it has to be a composting toilet, that basically that system that Rich Earth Institute is using where the urine is separated at the point of collection and sort of you have that mass of urine that's sitting there separate from the organic feces. Is that legally is that treated differently in Vermont law currently than other composting toilet systems, even though it's the more advanced and system we probably want to see more of?
I'll let Julia jump in there, but they're doing a great job, totally within Vermont requirements of operating their urine diversion collection systems within our regulatory structure. But Julia, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah. So for our systems and for all of the installations that we do locally, we have IA, innovative alternative permitting pathway that we've secured for the kinds of toilets that we install. And that includes for the barrels of urine, any container of urine. This is to my understanding, but anyone correct me if I'm wrong. A container of urine that's larger than 5 gallons is considered to be under the purview of what's considered a wastewater holding tank. So all of the barrels that we install in homes have secondary containment and are permitted according to the requirements for wastewater holding tanks, essentially, though it is just urine. And once we pasteurize the urine, our permit for sanitizing it is created following the EPA's guidelines for biosolid treatment. But we have a separate category that Vermont has created for us in the residuals department that's sort of a subcategory from biosolids that does recognize that it's urine and distinct from biosolid in some ways. So we have a little bit of a unique pathway there.
Deb.
Yeah, I thought maybe just another one of those slides, maybe slide 9.
Sure.
Just as a response to, you know, the original research done to figure out the temperatures was based on human pathogens. And so I just wanted to show this slide because these are some of the graphs that show it. I can't really quite read it, but some of them were more food waste related. In terms of thinking about total coliforms, you can see where that declines, or salmonella. It's time on the x-axis there, where you can see where they started up high when temperature was low, but once the temperature reached the higher temperatures, they've quantified that those do decline. I just wanted to point that a lot of that research originally started on human-based pathogens. And the coliforms is one of the ones that we're routinely testing and are concerned about in human fecal matter. So it's one of the indicators. So that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah.
Great. Yep.
That's great, Deb. I appreciate that. So one thing is, in the point you made, indicator organisms, that we're
Mhm.
looking at the number of organisms and things that can be insists essentially, and that can therefore be last over time. And thing that I know, the place we want to go is going to be the
Mhm.
Vermont Department of Health. I guess we haven't seen the case yet to make to the Vermont Department of Health, but their epidemiologist is where we go when we're changing a potential public health risk. So that's something that they would want to think about, that we want to get their epidemiological approval of this.
I I just wanted to respond slightly because I heard you talk about the survival structures, right? That
Yep.
are really resistant. I mean, that's a good point. We have the same in plant pathogens. That's where I got my PhD, was studying those. These organisms in soil are amazing, have amazing survival structures, and that makes them really hard to control. And so, at least from the plant pathology side, one of the tricks that we had was try to get them out of the dormancy stage and then impose a treatment. But I was going to say, it's not just human born, but pathogens in general have a lot of tricky life stages that we have to deal with.
For folks who haven't had a chance to fill out the survey from the Ecological Sanitation Coalition, I just put that link in there again. That's sort of asking about, your interests, what your practices are, what you're doing. That's in chat. And so thank you all for coming. But if anyone is interested in getting more involved in the legislative process or in our coalition, please reach out to any one of us. If you've obviously registered, you have my contact information directly. I'm part of the coalition. And so I can also help fold you in if you don't have Chrissy, Julia, or Deb's direct contact. And Deb, you wanted to...
I just was going to reiterate about this, or emphasize on the survey. Please help us spread that to beyond this group. We want as many people around to complete that as possible. So you could really help us on this project.
And that survey also includes what my last point I really wanted to make, also, that the majority of people using compost toilets in Vermont are using compost toilet systems versus composting toilets. So it's a lot of homesteaders. It's a lot of back to the landers. And, folks are not using these fancier systems that are not that those are great, but the majority of people are using a compost toilet system. So we want to support those guys too.
And I think that's a really great way to phrase it. Maybe we need to adopt that, compost toilet systems, to really emphasize that it is a managed system. Wonderful. Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody. I know we're at the top of the hour. I want to just be respectful of people's time, but really appreciated everyone joining us today. And thanks, Chrissy, Julia, and Deb, for being our expert folks who've spent years and years already working on this. Really appreciate all of your work. Yeah, we look forward to having more educational opportunities and for practitioners, but also for legislators and rulemakers in the coming weeks and months. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Thank
you.
Take care.